Good afternoon, everyone. It's Wednesday, May 21st, 2014. This is our 9th EPIP webinar of the year, Strengthening Nonprofit Funder Partnerships. I am your EPIP host, Michael Barham, along with my colleague here in the EPIP office, Emily Kessler. And our speaker for today is Christine Reeves of NCRP. We're going to be getting started momentarily, but before we do, allow us to tell you a little bit about EPIP for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work. We're a national network of foundation professionals and social entrepreneurs who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We are also an inclusive group of highly skilled and effective change makers committed to working together to building a just, equitable, and sustainable society. So what do? We provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice leadership skills, and voice emerging, unheard, transformative thoughts in the social sector. A couple of announcements. Surely many of you have heard of the upcoming Unity Summit. It is rapidly approaching. It's our 2014 national conference. We're partnering with the joint affinity groups to make it happen. We'll be talking about advancing equity of all types. Please check out the program schedule available on our website. There are some fantastic sessions and plenaries scheduled, and you'll be able to learn more details there. We also have a webinar upcoming shortly following the conference, Funding in Communities in Entrenched Poverty, Wednesday, June 18th, 3 p.m. Eastern, so it's 4 weeks from today. Please join us, and as always, for upcoming events nationally or near you on a local level, check out the website, epip.org/events. For those of you who are not EPIP members, as you've seen, we have a lot of fantastic events upcoming. A webinar slate is packed through the summer and the fall of 2014, and surely there are many local events as well. It's a great time to get involved. Visit epip.org/membership or contact me, michael@epip.org. I am always happy to discuss membership and here for those chats. Okay, we're going to get started shortly. Just a couple of quick items of housekeeping. You'll all be on mute. If you are calling in on the phone, please be sure to mute your computer so we can avoid echoes. You should see a question box there. If you have any issues, any technical difficulties, any audio issues, difficulty hearing myself or Christine or Emily, please type a question in the question box. And we'll reserve a few different portions during the webinar for Q&A. If you have questions, please type them in, and we'll be sure to make a point of getting to your questions with Christine. And we will be recording this webinar. For any reason you need to jump off early, it'll be available on the EPIP website within a week or so. And please reach out to me if you have any questions about that. Okay. We actually, before we introduce Christine, we'd like to run two quick polls. The first one, we want to learn a little bit more about you and your role in philanthropy. So I'm about to launch this poll. Hope everyone can just take about 5 to 10 seconds and select all that apply. I'll be launching this poll momentarily. Looks like most of you are voting. We'll be closing the poll shortly. Okay, great. I'm going to close this poll and share the results with the group. Looks like we have 52% staff at a foundation, 17% at an infrastructure organization, 35% staff at a nonprofit organization. So we have a pretty solid mix there. Alrighty, we're going to jump in to the next poll, we want to learn about whether or not you're planning to attend the upcoming JAG Unity Summit. I just mentioned it, and hopefully you know a bit about it, and we really hope you're planning to attend, so I'm going to launch that shortly as well. All right, folks, that poll will be closing momentarily. And I'll share the results with the group. Looks like only have about 10% of you coming. 70%, 76% won't be attending, and 14% of you don't know what the JAG Unity Summit is. Obviously, I didn't do a great job explaining it just a few slides ago, but please do check out the EPIP website. There's a lot of information there, and you can learn more about it. It's a really fantastic, very unique event. We have 300 registrants so far, so the word has really gotten out, and people are now excited. Okie dokie, so now that we're through the polls, let's introduce our speaker for today, Christine Reeves. Christine is the Senior Field Associate at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy at NCRP, the nation's only watchdog for grant-making foundations. Christine promotes socially just philanthropy that serves and empowers marginalized communities. Christine is also the vice chair of the EPIP DC chapter and a member of the EPIP national board. So she's very, very involved with our organization, and we're happy to have her join us today. She'll also be presenting at the JAG Unity Summit, speaking in a session titled, "What is the Role of Philanthropy in a Democracy? Thoughts from Emerging Leaders in the Federal Government." So again, you can check out more details about that session in particular on the EPIP website. As many of you will see today, Christine is a fantastic speaker and presenter and travels all over the country to present, so we're very, very grateful to have her here joining us and the EPIP community today, especially given that today is in fact Christine's birthday. So she's really going above and beyond and working very, very hard on her birthday. So we thank her so much. And without further ado, I am going to pass it over to you, Christine. Hi, and thanks for joining us.
Hi. Can everyone see the PowerPoint slide? In just 1 second, so it should be up. But hi, and thank you so much to Michael as well as to Emily from our EPIP staff based in New York for putting together not just this webinar, but the whole series. They've been really thoughtful this year. And I'm really glad to be here today. And we're going to just have sort of an informal conversation, however informal it can be when you're all at your own computer screens. But we're going to be talking about strengthening nonprofit funder partnerships. And I've done versions of this presentation in person about 5 or 6 times this past year and thought that it would be particularly helpful for the EPIP audience. And there'll be a couple times throughout for some interaction, and I'd love to hear from you. So mainly we're going to talk about these 10 tough conversations that keep coming up in the work I do, and they might be coming up in the work you do as well. So Michael just gave my introduction for me, but I'm not sure how familiar you are with the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and I like to use this visual of someone holding up a mirror, and I really see NCRP's role as a watchdog organization as holding up a mirror to philanthropy, showing the good, showing the not so good, showing excellence and showing where excellence can soon arrive. And we do a lot of reports. We're sort of part think tank, producing a lot of research. Our newest series of reports is called Philanthropy, which you can see on our website. We're doing different assessments of foundations across the country to increase transparency and use a social justice lens for philanthropy to help those who are most affected by problems be a part of the decision-making process. So today we have about 50 minutes, and during that time, there are mainly 4 things that I hope that we'll be able to cover. I'm going to talk about 3 problems that we're facing in philanthropy. We're going to do a fun activity, and then we're going to briefly touch on these 10 tough conversations and see if you have any thoughts about that. And we'll break that up into 2 sets of 5 so that you can keep all of them straight. So to start off, these 3 numbers, $3 billion, $47 billion, and $70 billion. So besides representing a lot of money, I often ask people if these numbers mean anything to them. And most of the time, people say no. But what I'd like to share is something that I actually keep these numbers on a Post-it note on my desk to remind me of why I do what I do. And that is because the first number, $3 billion, is how much the Gates Foundation gives away every year, roughly. $47 billion, again, is roughly how much our entire philanthropic sector, all foundations in the U.S., give away each year. And the final number, $70 billion, is the state of California's education budget alone from federal and state funding. So it really shows that even though philanthropy has tremendous resources, those resources are really eclipsed by just one state's education budget. And when a lot of foundations say, you know, I'm a small foundation, I'm not Gates, I'm not Ford, I'm not Rockefeller, we only have X number of dollars each year to give away, to really show that you most likely have more in common with the Gates Foundations than Gates does with one state's education budget. So to think about leveraging those dollars. So the second issue is thinking about the problems in our society. So every year, there's roughly 90,000 gun-related deaths in the United States. Global warming and climate change are calamities we're only beginning to understand fully. Each year in the U.S., 1 in 5 children are food insecure, meaning they don't know where or when they'll receive their next meal. And on any given day, 600,000 people in the United States are homeless. And that's roughly the size of an average congressional district. And I'm sure each of you know so many more stomach-churning statistics, and it's always a question of there not being enough time to focus on everything. So to think about this, we definitely have a limited dollar challenge. We definitely have a limited time challenge. But what I wanted to talk about today is the challenge that is in our control, and that's a power dynamic challenge. So if you didn't see that, this image is a golden retriever puppy sitting on another golden retriever puppy. And when I did a Google search of power dynamics under images, this was one of the first images that came up. And it's important to have some levity, but really showing that in our sector, there is more of a need for funding than a need to use funding. So the power is often in the hands of foundations, not the nonprofit grantees. But we call each other partners. And what I would like to pose is how much of that is true and how much of that might just be nominal. And how are we able to think about that? So when I was putting together this presentation, I wanted to share 2 more numbers. And one is 74,000 and one is 1.9 million, which I'll get to in just a second. But before that, I wanted to just preface with a quote that I really like, and it's Mary Jones, and she said, "My job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." And I feel like that's what I do at NCRP, and I feel that anyone working in philanthropy is comfortable. I myself am comfortable. People living on more than $2 a day, which half the world can't boast, are arguably comfortable. So how are we able to afflict ourselves with tougher questions and use levity in the process? But if we're getting a little uncomfortable, it often means that we're getting into some good territory. So if you remember again that 74,000 and 1.9 million, I sort of have a short exercise which can help with that. So this woman here is a little bit famous. She recently had a baby who's the next King of England, Kate Middleton, or the Duchess. And there's a theory called the veil of ignorance, which is why I used this image. And it's actually a theory belonging to Harvard professor John Rawls, who is a little bit less famous and easily identified. But he had a theory, again, called the veil of ignorance. And a lot has been written about this, but the short version is imagine you could create a society, everything in it, soup to nuts. You could decide who lived with beachfront property, who lived near a Superfund waste dump, who had a loving two-parent household, access to education, and who was in the foster care system and impoverished, who had disabilities, who didn't, who was male, who was female, everything. You could decide it. The only catch would be when you were done, you had to take off your veil of ignorance, and you wouldn't know your role in that society. You could be a mentally handicapped person living by a Superfund site, or you could be a billionaire on the water. And how would you create a society if you had to wear that veil as you were designing it? And most likely it would be a pretty equitable society. So the application I'd like to bring in is, what if you got this phone call? This would be the dream phone call. And this is not something that John Rawls said. But what if you got a phone call one day and someone called you up, said, Christine, or whatever your name is, I have $50 billion. Can you help me give it away in philanthropy? You get to decide who you get to fund, where you get to fund, what you get to do, how you're going to invest the money in socially and ethical ways. The only catch is you won't know until you're done if you're going to be the board chair, the CEO, a program officer, a secretary, an executive director applying for a grant, or a member of the community who could benefit from it. How would you design that society? And I think it shows that the power dynamics might be a little bit off, especially since the two numbers I mentioned, 74,000 and 1.9 million. 74,000 is about how many foundations there are in the country, and 1.9 million is about how many nonprofits. And imagine if those numbers were reversed. What if that happened? Would the nonprofit jobs be more coveted? Would there be nonprofit-only events as safe spaces away from foundations that keep trying to give us money? Would there be site visits of funder offices? Would nonprofits put out requests for proposals to funders because there wouldn't be enough nonprofits to take the money and the foundations would be nervous about getting their money out the door? And if that was the case, would there only be multiple year support? Would nonprofits review how foundations were investing their money in the market and want to make sure that they're doing it in ethical ways? What would that look like? So this isn't a coup d'etat in any way. This isn't trying to overthrow our current philanthropic system, but rather a good thought exercise that's often an onus of the foundation, which has more power to bring up than for the nonprofit. So with that, I thought we would do a quick activity before delving into 10 quick conversation starters. So in this activity, I'm going to share with you 3 executive directors. And I want you to imagine you're working at a foundation and you have one $10,000 grant left to give. And you have to decide which of these 3 executive directors, because so much it's about the relationship with a leader, not just institution to institution, would you fund? And at the end, Michael and Emily are going to help by releasing a poll, and you can vote for Executive Director A, B, or C. And we really encourage you to vote no abstentions, please. All right, so let's start with Executive Director A. She wants to end human trafficking. She wants to help survivors start a new life. And she wants to establish safe houses for victims as they transition. Here's a little bit about her. Since childhood, she's been a victim of violence and human trafficking. Some think that the violence she endured caused her a mental handicap. She has a history of breaking the law, but she was never convicted. She married a violent man and left him. She is illiterate and unable to keep a domestic service job. Very nervous. She never stays in one location for more than a few months. So this is Executive Director A. Executive Director B wants to overthrow the government, address racial inequities, and organize with a communist party. Here's a little bit about him. He is viewed as a radical. He worked as a night watchman for a long time and has been unable to keep a consistent job, especially because he was recently incarcerated. He has a reputation for being a little bit of a loose cannon and working with the Communist Party. So here's a little bit about Executive Director B. And finally, we have Executive Director C. She wants to create education reform and excellence, recruit 500 staff members in the next 5 years, and have every employee sign a contract so they can't quit in the first 2 years. Here's a little bit about her. She's a white, middle-class, 22-year-old college grad with no full-time work experience. Her mentors and professors are unconfident in her choices, and there's a rumor that she is living at home with her parents. So each of these have perhaps some deficiencies, but we have Executive Director A wanting to end human trafficking, Executive Director B wanting to overthrow the government, and Executive Director C wanting to create education reform and excellence. So if you want to take a second and think, which would I give a $10,000 grant to if I had to choose? And we'll release this poll.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to think about who they'd vote for. We'll leave this open for about 30 seconds. So take your time. We've got about half of you voting, so we'd love to hear, even if you're stuck on your choice, pick one that really resonates with you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thanks everybody who voted, and here are the results.
Okay, let me see if I can.
Can you see them, Christine?
Well,
I
can't.
Okay.
But I want to make sure people see me. So
I'll read them to you. It's 76% voted for Executive Director A.
Okay.
To end human trafficking. 8% voted for Executive Director B, and 16% voted for Executive Director C.
All right.
So I'm going to go ahead and hide these results and turn it back to you. Okay.
So let's think about these three. So Executive Director C, only 16% of you had confidence in her, but what would happen if I told you that she was Wendy Kopp, who started Teach for America? And for the 8% who voted for Executive Director B, what if I told you that he was Nelson Mandela? And for Executive Director A, which 76% had confidence in, despite her limitations, what if that was Harriet Tubman, who it actually is? And the point of this exercise was just seeing, how do we go beyond the grant application? How do we go beyond a quick site visit or information that we get from our peers in the field? And are we creating fertile ground for the next Tubman, for the next Kopp, for the next Mandela, and everyone in between? And how are we making sure that philanthropy is welcoming visionary leaders and not just encouraging incrementalism? So I did a session recently called Would Gandhi, Chavez, or King Receive a Grant Today? And we explored this a little bit more deeply in terms of what would they want from the philanthropic sector? Would we be pleasing them in both our grant making and how we're investing our endowments in ways that are ethical and environmentally sound? So I think that that could probably be an entire college course and the amount that we could talk about it. But just to really think about how are we innovating and encouraging philanthropy to support great leaders. So with the last half hour or so, I just thought we could delve in a little bit more into specifics, action items, if you will, which I go to so many conferences and I feel so blessed to learn so much from incredible people. But oftentimes at the end of a presentation, I think that was great, but how do I really apply that? Or that was interesting, but how would I even start? So what I thought might be helpful is these 10 conversation starters. Maybe none of them resonate with you, but they'll help you think of an 11th that will. Or maybe there's a couple you want to mention at your next staff meeting or meeting between funders and nonprofits or whatever it might be. So we're going to go through the first 5, and I'll just share a little bit about each one, and then we'll pause, and then we'll go through the last 5, and pause again for your thoughts or comments. questions or anything in general about NCRP, I'd be happy to talk to you about as well. So the first one, general operating support. So general operating support as opposed to programmatic support, where a foundation might fund a particular initiative around women and girls, but not necessarily funding that the nonprofit can use for computers or rent or salaries. So I was in Chicago about a year ago, and a funder there told me this interesting analogy of, if you're not funding general operating support, it's like buying a cappuccino but only paying for the foam, which I thought was really apt. And another one that I like to think about is, if you're a shareholder of a Fortune 500 company, would you write your check, but say to AT&T, for instance, it can only go towards technology for certain cell phones? Or would you say, you're a communications expert, I want to support you, let's get back to me in a year and see how it's going? Right now, of the 1,100 largest foundations based on asset size in the United States, the median amount of foundation giving that goes towards general operating support is just 7%, which is incredibly difficult for a lot of nonprofits. And when we get back to that golden retriever image, or that veil of ignorance image, thinking about, is that a true partnership? Is that truly trust? Is that truly giving? Or is that more strings attached? And there's definitely a place for programmatic support as relationships grow, but 7% does seem low. The second one is about multiple year support. So thinking about the long term, thinking about Gandhi, Chavez, King, Wendy Kopp, Nelson Mandela, Harriet Tubman, would any of them be able to achieve results in 365 days? If Martin Luther King told you his plan and you only got a one-year grant and had to renew and go through the application process, how would that look? And how are we encouraging deep, thoughtful leaders if we're not going to support them? I have a colleague of mine who compares it to marriage. Imagine if marriage was a single year with an option to renew, or your relationship with your kids. How are we forming true partnerships where the risk is spread evenly among nonprofits and funders? The third one is funding of marginalized communities. So NCRP, we track 11 different marginalized or underserved communities: women and girls, immigrants and refugees, the homeless, economically disadvantaged individuals, people suffering from HIV/AIDS. Our data is based on the Foundation Center, but however you define an underserved community. And we base this on this theory called targeted universalism, hence the target. And it's this idea of, if you have a grant and you want to help everyone, let's say in the city of Washington, D.C. equally, you probably aren't going to be able to achieve that, because the people with the most access and affluence are going to be able to access that funding better because they know how systems work, as opposed to picking a particular underserved community as specific as possible. Let's say Latina middle school girls in this zip code. You're going to be more likely to reach them, and they'll be able to benefit and be included in the process because the system will disproportionately help them because they arguably need it the most. And as a result, all of society can benefit because they're going to be healthier, happier, and contributing more. Another way to think about this is through this image, and it's something I found really helpful, where you have equity on one side on the left, and you have justice demonstrated on the right. So you want to give everyone an equal step stool, but if you gave step stool based on vertical limitations, let's say, you're actually creating justice on the right. So targeted universalism would favor the right side image. And the fourth, and just to say for marginalized communities, the median amount of foundation giving for marginalized communities is just 24% when we're looking at the 1,100 largest foundations in the country. And another statistic that's rather startling is, I'm in DC, and I read a report recently that only 5% of lobbyists in DC claim to represent underserved or marginalized communities. So if they're not a priority among philanthropy and among lobbyists and decision makers, how can we change that? So the fourth topic is social justice. So if you ask 10 people a definition of social justice, you'll probably get 11 answers. But at NCRP, we're thinking of it in terms of both outcome and process, so including those who are most affected by problems in the decision making, not just as being static recipients in a have, give to have not kind of world. And then also in terms of strategy. So foundations often pick a particular issue area or geographic area to fund, or sometimes even a community. But there's so many different tools in their toolkit that can include social justice strategies such as advocacy, community organizing, civic engagement, grassroots work, where you're really able to shift a lot of the power dynamics and have a higher return on investment. We did a series of reports called Grant Making for Community Impact, and we looked at 110 nonprofits across 10 states and 7 reports over 3 years. And we found that the foundations giving to those 110 nonprofits over that period of time yielded a $115 return for every $1 they gave in a grant. And the only thing that those 110 nonprofits had in common is each one focused on one or more underserved communities with that targeted universalism work and some form of a social justice strategy, whether it was think tank research, advocacy, to scrappy grassroots work and community organizing. So in terms of the return on investment, it was really astounding. And right now, the median amount of giving of the 1,100 largest foundations towards what they would define, however they define it, as social justice, is just 2%. And only 8% of the 1,100 largest foundations give 1/4 or more of their grant making towards social justice strategies. And just to imagine if that was the statistic for direct service work, if only a median of 2% went to food, shelter, or clothing. So just trying to address those numbers. And the last one in this section is this idea that's become more and more popular around smashing silos. We actually have a report called Smashing Silos, thinking about the importance of multi-issue work, multi-issue advocacy, how within and across foundations we're not siloing ourselves based on education program officers and health program officers, but how can we learn from each other, being incredibly important. So I would highly encourage and sort of promote our report of Smashing Silos to anyone who would be interested as just a helpful read. So with that, I'll just take a moment to pause. These were our first 5: general operating support, multiple year support, and one statistic I forgot to mention for multiple year support was that 89% of the 1,100 largest foundations give no multiple year support. Support for marginalized or underserved communities, support for social justice, and for smashing silos. And these are all helpful conversations for funders to bring up with nonprofits or vice versa. Not necessarily saying you must do it this way, but rather, are these tools we should be utilizing? Should we consider them? Are we considering them? If we're doing a great job at them, how can we share that work? Just to broaden the dialogue. So I just wanted to pause here to see if there were any thoughts or questions.
We do have one question here, Christine. It's from Jennifer, who asks, who says, it is interesting that we are discussing accountability, transparency, and power dynamics of foundations, and yet there was an obvious promotion of TFA, Teach for America, as a nonprofit, which is often and for the most part rightly criticized on these different points. Should there not be a balance in holding both sides of the relationship responsible for practices and outcomes?
That's a great question. Absolutely. I actually had about 10 different bios, and I kind of mixed them up just to have a diversity. I did a Susan B. Anthony one, a Florence Nightingale, just different people. And I decided to include Wendy Kopp because she is controversial on a lot of levels in terms of how seen as a darling, but also seen as someone who isn't helping education reform the way a lot of people want it to go. But I think accountability and responsibility, transparency is helpful on both sides. But with the power dynamics the way they are, with there being more need for funding than need to use funding, I often find the conversation being more about holding nonprofits accountable than the other way around. So I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about that. And in the presentation I referenced about would Gandhi, Chavez, or King receive a grant today, with my co-presenters, our opening icebreaker, we asked people to raise their hands if they were representing a nonprofit or if they were representing a foundation. And then we asked the nonprofits to raise their hands if they were assessed by their foundations. And they all raised their hands in terms of transparency or accountability of how they were using their funds, et cetera. Then we asked the foundations, please raise your hands if you do you receive some sort of assessment from your nonprofits, whether it's a third-party evaluation, a survey, one-on-ones, whatever that might be. And about, I'd say, a quarter of them raised their hands. And we asked them to keep their hands raised. These are the foundations again. If their access to their endowments was contingent upon a positive review from their nonprofit grantees, the same way that a nonprofit's access to their grants from a foundation would be contingent upon a positive review from the foundation. And of course, no one raised their hands. So I absolutely, in terms of your question, transparency, accountability galore, however you can discuss it, I think it's not a panacea, but I can hardly ever see it as being a bad topic to bring up. But I would just hope that we can even the balance a little bit more so that it's on both sides, and so that it can be a friendly conversation, so that it isn't seen as doom and gloom, but as exciting, as thoughtful, as generous. So I'm sure there's a lot of other opinions as well, but that was just something that came to mind based on your question.
Thanks, Christine. Jennifer writes back, wow, that is very interesting information that she did not know, and a great answer. So thank you. Thank you also, Jennifer, for your question. So if there's anybody else out there who has a question they want to ask Christine, please type it in the box and we'll get to it. And we have a little bit more time. We have 5 more conversation topics coming our way. So
okay, yeah, and if you have questions about the first 5, we can get to that after the second 5.
Exactly.
All right, and feel free to type them in as they come to you. All right, so let's go on with number 6. So impact investing has been another hot topic, if you will, often called mission investing, mission-related investing. There are PRIs. There's so much vocabulary around this. And a lot of people have very strong opinions about the words, but we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So for the sake of this conversation, we'll just call it impact investing. Just as an aside, if you ever want to laugh really hard, there's a website called philanthropyjargongenerator.com, which puts together like a slot machine, a noun, a verb, and a phrase that could be the title of any report. And I mention that because it is funny, but also showing that there can be a lot of barriers to entry when it comes to philanthropy from the nonprofit side, and transparency, which we just talked about, where if you are unfamiliar with certain phrases, imagine what grantees are, and oftentimes they might not want to say they don't know in front of a funder. So to really encourage a culture of asking questions is really helpful. And in particular, on this issue, so impact investing is, these 2 numbers will come to mind. So for most endowed foundations, they give away about 5% of their corpus or assets every year in the form of grants. This is one of the only requirements by the IRS, and one of the only things that endowed foundations have to comply with, as opposed to other sectors like government or for-profit business, which usually have a lot more to do than a foundation would. The 100%, though, is a more holistic way of looking at a foundation's assets. So why limit ourselves to just the grant making? How are we investing? And I've been doing a lot of work on this. NCRP just released a report in February, a publication that was completely dedicated to impact or mission investing. And we profiled some foundations and what's being done in the field. But if the most blatant example of this would be if your foundation is focusing on climate and environmental work with your 5%, giving it to great groups that are organizing and working on ending climate change problems, let's say, or cleaning rivers, but you're invested in ExxonMobil, or you're invested in major polluters like coal, is that the right thing to do? Is that actually going against your contract with the government for your tax-free status of doing public good? There's a lot of gray areas in this, certainly, but there are some pretty stark examples. And when we also think about the level of scrutiny, which can be a good thing, and the competitiveness with which foundations issue grants, oftentimes foundations only ask about their investments in terms of what is our return, how much money is our endowment growing, and linking that as the only part of their fiduciary responsibility. Of course, that's an overstatement, but for the interest of time, that's sort of a summation of a sort of worst case scenario. But we would just really encourage you to think about how are you activating not just your grant making theory of change, but your holistic philanthropic theory of change at your foundation that includes where you're investing, how you're investing. If you're doing shareholder activism, how you can leverage not just your grants, but your reputational capital. Stanford University just announced that they're going to be divesting from fossil fuels, and all other universities, because they're a leader, are taking note. Faith-based groups with endowments are doing this. Pension programs, hospitals. So where is philanthropy on this topic? And there's a great initiative called Divest, Invest Philanthropy that I would encourage you to check out if you're interested. All right, number 7. So innovation versus entertainment. And I would love to have a broader conversation if I could see all of you in person, but I've been talking to nonprofits for a couple of years now, and the word innovation seems ubiquitous in our sector. We love innovation, and most of the time it can be a really great thing, but again, this isn't a panacea. There can be bad innovation. Innovation could be teaching every kindergartner to smoke a cigarette. That would be deplorable and unconscionable, but that would be innovative. So just this idea that innovation isn't the goal, but rather it can be a positive strategy to helping achieve a goal. But when I talk with some nonprofits about this on a personal level, a lot of them either roll their eyes or sigh or look tired, and often when a funder says innovation, they hear the word entertainment, of how am I going to entertain the funder with this new idea, new strategy, even if the old ones are working. I went to an event where this one foundation was celebrating that 75% of their grantees were new that year and that they were on the cutting edge of innovative work. But that means that they let go 75% of last year's grantees. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do this, but how are we making sure that if our goal is to get senior citizens out to vote, a new phone app might not be the way to do it. It might be old-fashioned knocking on doors. Whereas in other cases, innovation is absolutely a good idea. So just seeing not just what we're saying, but how grantees might be hearing us as important. Number 8, this idea of being a supporter or a champion has come to mind. And I actually think there are a few more gradations, from evaluator to supporter to partner to champion. And what kind of philanthropic practitioner are you? I hesitate to even say funder because I find that to be a very limiting word, because funding is just one tool that foundations have that they can do to champion, if they wish, their grantees. And I wrote an article about being a generalist versus a specialist in philanthropy, and one of the analogies I gave was, because I have a theater background, of imagine a theater and the type of donors a theater can have. You have the marquee donor whose name is on the building. You have the one who is sitting in the front row clapping and cheering and giving out flowers. You have the one that's on stage bowing. You have the anonymous donor who no one even knows. And then you also have one that's waiting in the wings, that isn't just a donor, but that is ready to help out at a moment's notice, anticipating problems, wanting to be the first person that their actors / grantee partners can call on if there's a problem, that is excited to help and wear a lot of different hats. So clearly I have a favorite, but just figuring out what kind am I, what kind is my organization. Maybe it's one I didn't even mention, maybe this analogy isn't helpful, but how can I be more than just a funder? Can I be a champion? What does it being a champion look like for me? And if I am doing it well, how do I share that with my peer institutions who might be seeking new ideas for this? Number 9 is about measurement and evaluation. So I think some of the most popular sessions at the conferences I go to have one of these 2 words in it. But I would just step back a little bit. I kind of feel, and this is just my personal opinion, not the opinion of NCRP, but that philanthropy is kind of becoming the new math, where if we can't put a quantitative metric on something, it's not a positive or helpful theory of change. And if we were to really do this, I think that we would all be in the business of funding giving out free lunches, because you can go from giving out 100 to 1,000 to 100,000 and make your bar charts go up and measure and evaluate that successfully for board meetings. But we might not be pausing to ask, do people need lunch? Maybe they need dinner. Maybe they need job training. Who is making the lunches? Are they healthy? You know, there's all these different questions to ask that might be more qualitative, and that kind of measurement and evaluation is just as helpful. And I also wanted to plug the Marguerite Casey Foundation. They don't use these terms. I forget the actual phrase they use, but they are in the business of helping grantees create success and to figure out how do we tailor our evaluation work so that it's what the grantees want to measure. If people are dedicating their lives to ending poverty, then our evaluation isn't going to motivate them more or less. How do we collaborate in this and make this an exciting time where we can figure out what works together? So just how can we put a different spin on measurement and evaluation? And there are so many great groups doing that. I was just, again, listing a worst case scenario. And finally, respecting time. I went to a fantastic session at the GEO conference that was co-led by a group called Project Streamline. I highly suggest you check out their website and their work. Jessica Bierman does great work for them, among others. And they had a list of suggestions that align a lot with NCRP's criteria for philanthropy at its best. But one that really resonated with me was this issue of respecting grantees' time, where if you think about it, if you're a program officer, how quickly grantees reply back to your phone messages or emails. Or if you're wanting to set up a site visit, are we making sure that it's on the grantee's time schedule that works for them when their default is to say yes no matter what? How would the relationship work if you actually heard a no sometimes? Would that mean that you're actually growing in trust? And another thing I wanted to mention that Project Streamline recommended was having all board members and staff members actually fill out your grant application and time yourself and figure out how many other grants that your grantees would be filling out as well, and how if they are too labor intensive, you're actually taking away time and resources from the causes you care about because the people doing the work are spending too much time on paperwork. So how can we streamline that process? These are just a few of the ideas, but again, I highly encourage you to check out their website. And I just wanted to wrap this up with 2 quotes before we just ask some questions for the last 5 or 10 minutes. One is Martin Luther King, and he had said that philanthropy is commendable, but it shouldn't allow the philanthropist to overlook causes of economic injustice which require philanthropy. And the second is from Archbishop Camara from Brazil, and he said that when I give people food, I'm called a saint, but when I ask why people are hungry, I'm called a communist. And this idea in our sector where we don't need to get reelected, we don't have shareholders and customers that we're accountable to. There's a tremendous amount of freedom, but how are we able to be accountable to that? And how are we able to lift people up in the process and not be afraid of what we might be called? Because there's a lot of great work to be done, and I'm so excited about the future of philanthropy, and I think we can't necessarily control at the beginning the limited dollar challenge or the limited time challenge, but we definitely can address the power dynamic challenge. And when we work in our sector, human capital is the most important thing. We're not creating a product at the end of the day. It's about the people. So how are we able to champion and support them? And these 10 conversations or ones that come to your minds might be part of the answer. So these are the second 5: impact investing, as well as vocabulary in general, innovation versus entertainment, support, champion, measurement and evaluation, and respecting time. So if there are any questions about this or any part of the presentation, or if you just have lingering thoughts or ideas that you want to share with the group, I think we still have a few minutes.
Thank you, Christine. This was a really enlightening conversation. I know as someone who used to be a funder, I remember having a lot of these experiences myself. And I have to say, I love the idea from Project Streamline that foundation officials should be filling out their own applications for that experience. I think that's really actually very key. Probably not something that anyone's going to have the time to do, but being able to have that perspective is really critical in being effective in your job going forward. So
yeah, I think it also just comes down to empathy. Each one of these, I think it's the empathy. If you were walking in your nonprofit grantee's shoes,
right,
and giving grace and giving thoughtfulness and being a servant leader, and there's so many more than these 10, but how would you like to be treated could be helpful. Exactly.
And sometimes you just don't know until you do that work. So we do have time for a couple of questions if anyone would like to pose some questions to Christine, or they have a comment. I have to say I'm looking forward to your talk at the JAG Unity Summit. That should be really terrific. So we have a comment from Sarah who says that was a great presentation, and I agree. We always love having you lead some of our webinars and chapter events. So we're very appreciative of your time today. And it looks like you were extremely thorough, Christine, because there are no lingering questions.
People are chewing on things, and I know that it's hard in a webinar setting. But if you have any additional questions, I can be reached at creeves@ncrp.org. There are lots of great reports that were the basis of each of these 10 bullet points. I'd be happy to share. I will be at the Unity Summit, and as an EPIP board member, I encourage all of you to come. It'll be in my hometown, Washington, D.C., which is exciting, not to get on an airplane,
right,
at least for DCers. But a lot of times at EPIP, we might feel that we're too young, or we don't have that title that's a director, VP, or something like that, so we might not be able to share some of these thoughts or our own thoughts with our managers or with others. And I just really encourage you to, something I've been trying to do lately is be just 10% bolder than you are, and try to have that conversation. You won't come across as rude. You can say that I said it and get a little bit of distance if you want.
Blame it on Christine.
To think about it. And the other thing is, we've been having some EPIP conversations lately of how do we make sure that EPIP or our own groups of any kind are different. And if we took out the word philanthropy and put in auto industry or put in telecommunications industry, would our missions still make sense? Would our reports still make sense? Because all those industries are interested in the next generation, or being innovative, or having measurement and evaluation, and respecting time. So what makes us different? And I really think it's the empathy and the service and contribution to the public good. So just final food for thought, but I will get off my soapbox now.
No, those are great thoughts to end us with. As Michael mentioned earlier, we're recording the webinar, and assuming technology doesn't fail me in the next 5 minutes, we'll have it available on the blog within the week, and we'll be sharing the slides. And so look for an upcoming webinar recap on the EPIP blog. And I want to thank Christine again today for for your presentation, for your words, for your thoughtfulness and your caring and your empathy. And we look forward to seeing everybody at the conference in 2 weeks, and also here in future webinars. So stay with us. If you're not on the EPIP mailing list, definitely sign up. And if you're interested in hearing more about board recruitment, we have that process going on as well. So check out the site for that as well. So thank you again, Christine. And thank you everybody for tuning in today. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Michael.